So yesterday on Discord, we managed to change a Bezier curve into a volume mesh, and somebody asked for a tutorial. So let's begin. Alright guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing very well. Now to be honest, I've not really covered geometry nodes. There's some really good tutorials out there on YouTube. I highly recommend you check them out. Guys like Erlendale, stuff like this. But today I'm going to show you how to quickly change a curve into a volume to mesh and then convert it back into a mesh. Now I'll explain the reason why you need to do this. But first of all, what we need to do is we need to drop down a Bezier curve. So what I can do here is I can press Shift and A and I'll just quickly drop down a Bezier. Now we'll use this as a template for drawing our Bezier curve. But you can't just drop geometry nodes onto a Bezier curve. What you need to do is you actually need to use another object. So we'll use a default cube here. The default cube always comes through. And I'll go to the geometry nodes tab. Now I'm using Blender 3.0. It's the latest version. It's a little bit unstable to be honest, but it'll get us by for today. And what I'll do here is I'll hit new. Now I do not need a group input node because I'm not making any input, but what I do need is an object info node. And it pretty much does exactly what it says in the tin. It grabs the object info. So let's search for object info. I'll click on the dropper tool and I'll select the Bezier curve that we dropped down. Now there's several things I could do here. What I could do is I could resample the curve, or I could use curve to points. So that's what I'll use curve to points, and it gives me a little bit more freedom to be honest. So let's put the geometry into the geometry, and let's put the geometry into the group output. So you can see here I have a count of 10 points, and that's because I'm using the count option. Now I can change this to evaluated. Now what essentially evaluated is the steeper the curve or the more angle on the curve, it will add more points. And it's pretty good, it comes in handy as well. But the best thing to do is probably use length, and we can make this 0.1. Now obviously we can put this up and down, but it's best just to leave it on 0.1. Now essentially what we're doing here is we're distributing points on a curve. Excellent. Now there's several things we could achieve here. What we could actually use is a point to instance. So we could instance an object on each of these points, but what we're going to use is a points to volume. So Shift A, S to search, points to volume, and this will essentially change each of these points into a volume. And we get this kind of nice smoke effect. Now there is a caveat with this and I'll explain it in a second, but you can see here we can change things like the density, the voxel amount, and even the radius. So what we can now do is we can go back into layout, we can select the Bezier curve, we can go into the edit mode, we can press A to select everything, we can delete these, and we can then use the draw tool, which is here on the left hand side, and we can draw something very mature. Get your minds out the gutter. It's a happy face. So as you can see, when we draw the curve, it essentially creates a nice volume. Now this is great for doing things like clouds. Okay, they're crappy clouds, but you get the point. Now there is an issue with geonodes at the moment. Now obviously it is early days to be honest, but you can't directly texture the volume. But if you actually go into cycles for example, what you do is you get a kind of nice basic cloud, but there's no way to actually texture this at the moment. And that is something to do with geometry nodes, but there is a kind of workaround. It's not the best to be honest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the cube, I'll go back into the geometry nodes, and what we can do here is we can actually change this back into a volume, which lets us then add the principal volume shader. So I can press Shift and A, S to search, and we'll do a volume to mesh. Now this is a pretty good technique to be honest, being able to change a volume back into a mesh. It comes in handy, especially if you're doing a lot of resampling. Now there's a few things we can actually change here. If we change the threshold, we can actually get more detail. We can put the adaptive setting up, and that's pretty cool to be honest. Now obviously what we can now do is assign a texture, so press Shift and A, S to search, material, material assign. Now I don't actually have a material created, but I can actually use the cube, so that's called material. So we can select the material here, and we can actually go into the shading editor. Now one thing we can do is we can change it from a principal BSDF to a principal volume. Now this is kind of strange to be honest. If you jump into shading tab, the principal volume is still put into the surface. It should be in the volume. I think that's an oversight in Blender's part. Now you'll probably think it's not working, why is it still black? So let's quickly jump into the render viewport. Now keep in mind geometry nodes really need cycles, and there we have our cloud, and we can play around with things like the principal volume, the colour attribute, the density, stuff like this, and we can pretty much treat it just like any other kind of volume. And that is pretty much curve to volume. It is a little bit janky at the moment, and it probably will get better, but it's a very nice technique, especially when you're doing stuff in layout. Let's go into the Bezier curve and let's just draw something again. let's select all the points. Do me a favour guys, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, follow me on Twitter, you know what to do.